Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. My name is Robert Llewellyn. I am the founder and one of the presenters of the Fully Charged Show and the Everything Electric Show, our very exciting and rapidly growing sister channel. I'm just saying this as a bit of background for people who may not have seen or watched or heard anything about the Fully Charged Show in the past. So just briefly, it's been going since 2010. That is about just coming up to 14 years. And we've studied and followed and observed and witnessed an incredible technological transition in that time towards the electrification of ground transport, renewable energy, grid infrastructure, charging infrastructure, home energy systems, new technologies, completely new inventions that didn't exist 14 years ago, and we cover all of those across those two channels, and on the podcast interview people who are intimately involved in this process, all sorts of people from all around the world, and today is no exception, because one thing is true beyond all others: this is not a local small little bit of a transition in one little area. This is a global phenomena. This is a massive industrial revolution around the world, and it affects everywhere. It affects it in different ways, but it is having an impact everywhere. And one area that we know quite well, and I know well personally because of my own personal history, is Australia. So today we're talking to Behyad Jafari, who is the boss of the Electric Vehicle Council in Australia, and they're a kind of lobbying group and a pressure group. And they're amazing what they've done. Really important work in educating and informing the general public, but also coordinating between all the different companies involved and the Australian government. And the speed of the change in Australia is kind of staggering, because it was delayed for so long, quite deliberately by the previous administration there. There was they were definitely behind the curve in comparison with, say, North America or European countries or China. Now they're catching up so fast. So the change is really breathtaking there, and the amount of electric vehicles available there and the amount of electric vehicles people have there is really exciting. And so I kind of wanted to catch up with him, because we are going to be doing our second Australian show, the Everything Electric Show, on the 9th, 10th and 11th of February at the Sydney Olympic Park, which is a much bigger venue than we were at last year, simply because we need a much bigger venue. This show has grown I don't know what you can call it, vertically. It's not a little curve. It went like this big, and then it's gone like that. So it's going to be extraordinary. There's so many car companies going there, so many home energy companies, people who we just do. It's going to be amazing. I'm not going to go on about it. I'm really looking forward to it. So we cover a lot of the things that have affected the Australian market in the last few years, and particularly in the last, say, 4 or 5, which is really when this transition has really kicked in. And Behyad is such a great advocate for electric vehicles, so well informed, so kind of unemotional, which I think is kind of important. Something I fail at occasionally. Sorry. But he's a very clear thinking. He understands the industry, he understands what's going on in Australia, comes out of an energy background rather than an automotive background, which is always good. And I just knocked the mic then, but I'm not going to redo it. That's it. I just wanted to give that brief background. Electric cars make so much sense in Australia, and we're really excited to be there again next year. So we're really looking forward to it. 9th, 10th, 11th of Feb. Sydney Olympic Park. I don't even know what it's called. You know where it is. If you live in Australia, you'll know where that is. It's where the Sydney Olympics were. It was an amazing time that was. 2000. Very special. That's all. Obviously, please do tell your friends about this channel and this particular podcast, and subscribe to it if you haven't already, because we constantly have the most amazing people on this show. And I really hope you enjoy it. So please welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast, Behyad Jafari. So Behyad, thank you so much for joining us. This is really good to catch up, because it's a personal obsession of mine. What's going on in Australia for obvious reasons to our long-term viewers and listeners, but it's such an interesting country to see how quickly it's changed. So I had a 5-year gap where I wasn't in Australia, and in that time, when I was back there earlier this year, I just couldn't believe how much it had changed in regards to electric vehicles and the infrastructure. Because I don't remember ever seeing a car charger other than a Tesla supercharger last time I was there. And there probably were some, but I didn't see any.
Yeah,
But
it is really.
that's shifted, isn't it?
It has, and that's what I was reflecting. It is really nice to catch up because I remember last year when Fully Charged came and set up for the first time. It was, we've been in probably a 24-month period just going from landmark to landmark of how, hitting those tipping points, really seeing electric vehicle uptake start to accelerate, where people would frequently report back, I'm always seeing electric vehicles on the road. I went from never seeing any to seeing one every day now, seeing more chargers being built, and even then having the Fully Charged event of saying, well, now we also have this great big landmark event for all of these people who we know are absolutely interested about electric vehicles, have these things to be able to go to as well. So it is it's like the old joke of how you become an overnight success. You work really hard for 15 years, but it is sort of slowly, then all at once. And I think certainly now, probably for the last 3 years, it's really felt like all at once.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, can you just give us? It'd be good to get a bit of background, because I'm aware of what you're doing, but of the Electric Vehicle Council. I mean, how long it's been going, what its role is in Australia, what you're up to.
Yeah, so we're set up as an industry association. So we represent sort of companies. There are different types of industry associations. We have some 102, 103 odd members, and we really represent companies right across the ecosystem. So car companies and charging companies, of course, you would expect them to be in an electric vehicle council, but the big banks are members of ours. Large customer groups like Woolworths, Coles, IKEA, people around the world will know Woolworths and Coles are our big retailers or grocers for people, our global listeners. And their main participation in our organisation is as customers, really through their large heavy vehicle fleet. They're sort of transitioning their trucks. So we sort of look at that entire ecosystem around electric vehicles, bring everyone together, and we do everything from where we were really born around doing the policy and advocacy work to accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles to working on issues ourselves as an industry. So if we've got these massive, iconic Australian companies wanting to transition, well, how can we get on with helping them do that? Of course, the government plays a strong role in that, but so do the rest of us. And nowhere along that journey do we want to say to someone, well, we only want to do this part of the work and then good luck to you. We say, well, no, we want to make sure that you're successful. We want to make sure you go on this journey. And that for us, we started as a national organisation in this sense back in 2017. I'd spent a couple of years before that sort of setting something up without really the intention of this becoming my job. That sort of happened a bit by happenstance, by somewhat by accident, somewhat by good fortune. And then we started doing this work full time in 2017, really out of unlike a lot of other countries and a lot of partner organisations around the world, the governments weren't really taking the reins by the horns, the horns by the reins, whatever the saying is. They weren't really...
The bull by the horns, maybe.
That's right, the bull by the horns in Australia, in some cases actually being quite resistive and, being quite sort of Trumpian and, anti-electric vehicle. So certainly we didn't have a similar journey where the government was ready to go and we were there to help them. And really back then, the story was much more, particularly energy companies and car companies would, sit around saying, well, we all get this, we're all across it, we're all global, we understand what's happening, but none of it's really happening here. And there was just a bit of an effort to say, well, why don't we put our shoulder behind it? Given the government's not going to be the one to drive it, maybe we have to be the ones to drive it ourselves. And sure enough, we found that as we did that a bit, we were successful because, of course, we were already behind the rest of the world. So we weren't, trailblazers. We weren't inventing anything new. We were saying, let's just do the things that have already worked, trying to do them here. And sure enough, that helped. So our mission all along has been to accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles in Australia. So not just to let them happen, not just to play a bit of a coordinating role, but what can we do that'll make it happen faster and ideally exponentially faster than it would have otherwise in Australia specifically. And I say that because that It sounds like a very bullish task to take on, but most of our work has actually been trying to catch up to a lot of other markets around the world,
Right.
given how much further behind we started.
I mean, because that's one of the fascinating things about Australia is, excuse me, the kind of contrast between, say, electric vehicle adoption and solar panel installation. I mean, it's the most remarkable thing when you just, you have to play I Spy to see the house that doesn't have solar panels.
Yeah.
Because there are some, but very few. And but that was a really interesting transition. And that happened quite a long time ago. That's not so recent, is it? I mean, that's a very common thing.
Yeah, I mean, one part of that is simple as, of course, it's Australia. We have a lot of sunshine, so it just makes a lot of sense. Now, using that sunshine to power our cars also make a lot of sense. But if we sort of look back, through time, and again, a lot of the playbook that we borrow from, I come from the electricity and renewable energy world, not from the vehicle side. So the E, not the V. And a lot of the playbook is we're just stealing from what worked in solar. So again, we had, there's been a pretty big difference in Australia traditionally with things like renewable energy and action on climate change based on who is elected. So, look at, countries like the UK, and there's quite a lot of things that your two main political parties are different about, but it seems like your approaches to these issues aren't wildly volatile, at least. Whereas in Australia, they have been. You've had a party that's our Conservative Party was, for a good long time, really climate denying and quite proud of that. Moving towards not necessarily being denying, but not doing anything about it either, to a Labor Party that is sort of much more sort of progressive on these issues. And of course, the other minor party is much more progressive on these issues. So we had that, we know that it works in Australia because we did have more progressive parties who in solar put in the right regulations, put in a short-term number of incentives, made them easily accessible to Australian consumers, and we absolutely took off. I'm not sure if it's still correct as of today, but for good portions of the time, Australia is actually has the highest net uptake of solar panels, rooftop solar panels, of any country in the world.
Yeah,
and we're a much smaller population than other countries around the world. So the fact that we have higher uptake, not per capita, completely, really shows you that we do have this market of people with smart, savvy consumers who like new technology and like the things that it gives them, because like with solar panels, the big thing that it gave them was being able to save on their energy bills. The climate stuff was very nice, but it was that, I can make my own power and use it. Why wouldn't I do that? I'm no sucker. And again, we're now finding with EVs, certainly we spent a few years with those early adopters who are buying electric vehicles, willing to pay a bit more, willing to not have enough chargers available to them for environmental reasons. But as we've been able to build out that ecosystem, have more affordable models available, more options, and many, many more chargers, and sort of much more education about electric vehicles, we are now finding that primary consideration is people saying, petrol bills suck and I want to get away from them, and they only ever go in one direction and it's completely out of our hands. So why wouldn't I want to switch and also do something nice for the environment? That's lovely. But, I also want them for all these other great reasons.
Because, I think that argument, that's certainly an argument I've used in this country is forget the environment, forget tree hugging, forget all that. It's, from experience. And this is how, when you can talk from, with genuine knowledge from actual experience over many years, it's cheaper to run an electric car than a petrol one. And and also our total reliance on foreign oil, which has really hit home here in the last couple of years because of Ukraine and Russia and everything that went on there. I think that's generally more aware. But that's also the case in Australia. Australia has such a huge abundance of raw materials off the scale, except oil. It doesn't have a lot of oil. I think Australia produces, I looked it up, 0.002% of global oil and gas.
Right. And similarly for our own needs, it's something like, a couple of years ago when we used to use this a lot, it was something like 92% imports, of oil or of transport fuel, and only ever going in one direction again. So we have, I think, about 2 petrol refineries still open, really on their last legs, really looking more at things like some sovereign jet fuel and the like, for instance, right? So you're right, it is all imported. We've always been an energy powerhouse. We're turning into a renewable energy powerhouse, because the other thing that we have a lot of is coal. So we've always been an energy powerhouse in one way or another. Now a renewable energy one. And again, all the battery metals required to make the batteries that go into the world's electric vehicles, not just our own, they all exist in Australia, and
Yeah.
usually we have either the first, second, or third highest supply or highest reserves of them. So again, when I talk about that entire ecosystem that we seek to represent, it's who stands to benefit out of this? Because it's sort of a little bit strange that our politics has been somewhat constrained, or that this issue has been seen as being political,
Yeah.
because really it should be, Australia should be more like a Norway, pushing the world to go much further, purely out of selfish interests, purely
Yeah.
to say, well, we've got this stuff to sell. You should all be banning petrol in vehicles and just buying our batteries. But instead,
Yes.
we've sort of, unfortunately, some people chose to treat this as a bit of a political football, act on it a little bit less. And again, we have seen, and a big part of this has also been that, federally I think we had a change of government as well, and so there was a change of federal approach to these issues. And really, again, Australians are the ones who have shown up since we've had, both the industry has worked very hard. I don't want to give the government all the credit. We've been the ones building those charging stations, making the vehicles available, making, loans, finance options and loans and subscription options available to consumers. And as we've gotten those things right, we've seen in the last 3 years, every year we've doubled the sale of electric vehicles.
Right.
Doubled the number of electric vehicle sales. And again, starting from a low number, but we're seeing now we're not talking about incremental increases anymore, where we are now at an exponential phase.
Right. I know, because that's the thing I wanted to ask, if those sort of because sales have continued. I mean, I was there up until March of this year,
Mm-hmm.
and it was clearly the case then. And I mean, it's been the case in the UK. We've had this.
Right.
We've had a drop in the sales of electric vehicles. It's so funny how the press can interpret this. Electric vehicle sales drop. Well, they've dropped a bit from a ridiculously high growth, and they've kind of leveled off. And petrol and diesel sales have fallen off a cliff. They just don't. Diesels.
Right, yeah.
No, people. The diesel sales in this country are minute now, and they used to be the majority. So that's really shifted.
I do find it very funny, because I do see those stories out of the USA, out of the UK, and the odd, lobbyist who tries pushing those narratives here in Australia as well. And so, globally in the USA, we're seeing electric vehicle sales go up by about 50%. That's not true in Australia. We're going up by about 2.4 times higher than we were this time last year. So we're already 2.4 times higher with a month left to go, a month up our sleeves. So, I think obviously we see those narratives play out for particular reasons. Sometimes it's journalists writing them because they see a release and they don't know any better. I know certainly in the USA, much like in Australia, they're working on their latest set of light vehicle CO2 standards. In the UK, you've just had your shift around the ban of petrol and diesel vehicles in the ban year. Australia, we're actually working on our first ever fuel efficiency standards. We've never had them in place, and the government's working on them. And so sure enough, you see this very strange, steady trickle of stories coming out of, sales are going backwards. No, sales are, as I mentioned, they're more than double in Australia. They're going up very, very high. You can't fall for, odd little things here or there. And again, we are seeing, I think there's sometimes a bit of confusion of when we talk about sales double, that doesn't mean that every brand and every model doubles.
Yes.
Right. So people look at these little examples and say, well, that one wasn't successful, therefore EVs aren't successful. And so, well, no, EVs are wildly successful. It's just that, it's not evenly, it's not even right across the market.
Yeah. Because I think I do want to. You did mention it earlier on, but I think it's a really important aspect of the electrification of ground transport to be grandiose. Is trucks and vans, and that often happens without the press or the general public or people who've, your posh friend down the road who's bought a Tesla. You might talk about that, but you wouldn't talk about the delivery company that's driving around in electric vans and has been for the last 3 years. I mean, that just sort of happens under the, just doesn't get the attention.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't get the headlines. In some ways, we look at that sector and we say, well, actually, you can probably move faster than light vehicles. It is particularly when, I love these managed fleets where people buy things using spreadsheets, because we go, well, we can make the spreadsheets make sense for you. Whereas, of course, with light vehicles, you're talking about private consumers and how they feel about cars and what color it comes in, what shape and sizes it comes in, and all those type of things. So, it's a much more logical discussion. And that's where we can see, when we work with fleets, you can often see that going electric is they're already in the money. They're already better off buying a more expensive electric truck, but by far lowering their operating costs. And for them, the operating cost isn't some vague unknown of how much do I pay for petrol, how much do I pay for maintenance. You're dealing with companies who can tell you, well, over 5 years, this is exactly how much we pay, for petrol or for maintenance. So it's a really fascinating sector. We've been able to do some really cool, interesting work. Some of it has been a little bit Australian specific because Australia, we, for some reason, sometimes love to design our own standards for things. So when you sell a car in Australia or a truck in Australia, you have to meet Australian design rules as opposed to sort of global ones or globally homologated ones. Some of it has just been clearing off some of those hurdles. And again, we are finding that as we do that, the supply of different electric truck models are there, electric van models are there, and companies are quite eager for one reason or another. It's just the pure savings or the savings plus that promotional benefit of being able to say that they're doing so. That is an opportunity that's there. Both sides, both demand and supply are there and ready to go. So I think it's one where, like with in some ways, like with the light vehicle market, people are going to be surprised where I think you turn around one day and things have changed so much where, you keep expecting to be these sort of gradual tipping points. But I think, in fact, what you find is, of course, my deliveries come from an electric truck. That's just how the world works.
Yeah. And I mean, that I think the other thing that's happening here, which I've sort of read a little bit about, is happening in Australia as well, is the second-hand market. Because that's one thing, the kind of, I think, totally legitimate reason and an excuse that many people have. Like, I'd love to have an electric car, but they're just too expensive.
Right.
And I mean, before I had an electric car, and when I was a younger man, I didn't even know people. I never met anyone who'd bought a new car. That was so weird. And I always had second, third, fourth, fifth hand ones. And that's what's just starting to happen here now, like on a large scale. So next year, I know there's going to be hundreds of thousands of electric cars coming on the market from all the fleet leasing companies.
Yes,
have got to their first sort of circulation of that. And I would think similar things are happening in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a really important part of the story because something like 3/4 of people, certainly in Australia, 3/4, 75, 80% of people only ever buy used vehicles.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense as well. So, we sell something like 1 million new vehicles every year, new cars in Australia every year. We have some 20 odd million cars on our roads already. So we spend all of our time talking about new car sales, how to get them to be electric, whether it's fuel efficiency standards or incentives or charging or whatever else. Because in reality, there's only one way that we get a secondhand car, right? You can't build a secondhand car. You have to get those people who buy new ones to buy, new things, new electric cars. But really, overwhelmingly, the only reason that whole discussion matters is so that in 3 to 5 years' time, you get secondhand electric vehicles. And so, that's been one of those hazards of Australia being later to the fold is by the time you start taking those actions and you start seeing, I think, probably quite likely this year, we're going to end the year with 100,000 electric vehicle sales. That means that we'll have 100,000 secondhand cars in 3 to 5 years' time. Yeah. So this has been that concern, and sometimes you get that feedback of, well, given the whole world's going in this direction, why don't we just do nothing and it'll sort of happen to us eventually anyway? This is that big problem of the overwhelming majority of people, but certainly people on lower incomes who can only afford fourth-hand vehicles, third or fourth-hand vehicles, as well as crime, they have to wait even longer. So you're just leaving those people behind. You're forcing them to continue buying much less efficient, much more inefficient sort of high gas guzzling vehicles that cost a lot more to run. Yeah. Whereas the sooner we act, sure, it's very shiny that I get to tell you the market share of new car sales has increased, has doubled every year, and that's wonderful. But really, all that means is we're finally only 3 years away from being able to help that person on a lower income who needs that secondhand vehicle coming out of that fleet car. So it's that really big danger. And I don't need to tell you this, I don't need to tell your listeners this, but it's that big danger of anything that we do, whether it's sort of delaying targets or whatever else, any of that delay just causes years more pain for those people who really need things to be accelerated as much as possible.
Yeah, because that's something I didn't know that Australia has had for some time a a reputation for being a dumping ground for inefficient vehicles that no one else wants, and we'll send them to Australia. The manufacturers go, oh, we can shift a few of these. I mean, is that true? I don't know how accurate that is.
So strangely for Australia, we've never had light vehicle CO2 standards, or what we in Australia call fuel efficiency standards. So there's never been that regulatory carrot and stick in place there. So car companies that do sell electric vehicles, wonderful, and it's all upside for them, right? They're not looking at avoiding CO2 credits or gaining credits, I should say, or avoiding penalties. And similarly, car companies with very old and inefficient gas guzzlers have no reason not to be disposing of them here. So we do see this trend, around the world, where as engines become more efficient in order to meet CO2 standards around the world, you really, and I don't sort of say this to criticize the car company and say these are evil Mr. Burns types, because you're saying the incentive for you is either, as we forced you to develop a newer engine, even for getting electric vehicles, a more efficient engine, the old one that you've already spent money on building and have production lines for, you can either dispose of them, and lose all of that, sunk investment, or you can continue to amortize them by finding somewhere else to keep dumping these vehicles.
Right.
And so quite often when you look at the type of models that we get and the technology inside of the models of vehicles that we get, in a lot of ways our quite high selling cars reflect third world countries, right? It's sort of us,
right.
We're often lumped into that rest of the world category, and the type of vehicles that you will only sell to countries that don't look and feel like the Australian market at all.
Yeah.
But again, it is why wouldn't a car company do that if that's something that they have the permission to do? It's meaning that Australian drivers have to pay more, for more petrol or more diesel to do the same job. But that profit of not needing to invest in that better, newer technology gets to go into the pockets of car companies.
Yeah.
And so, not to get too philosophical, but it's why you have governments and regulations in the first place, right?
Yes.
Well, we want to tilt that scales back towards our own consumers. Yeah. And so we're in this really weird space where across the developed world, it's really us and Russia who don't have these standards in place. Even countries like Saudi Arabia do, and we don't have them. We don't quite want Saudi Arabia's regulations, but at least they have something, and we don't. So again, it's a good thing. Our government has now committed to doing them. They've started working on them. Governments have previously committed and started working on them, and there have been quite well-funded efforts to kill them off in the past. We're much more sort of hopeful and ambitious this time around. Governments been taking a bit of time. They spent all year working on them so far, and we've been telling them to get on with it already. It's complex, but it's not quite that complex.
Yeah.
But I think we're quite hopeful that we're finally going to get there. And really for us, it means both, people buying petrol and diesel vehicles can get the same car that they already want, that they drive today that just uses less petrol and diesel to do the same job. But also, by increasing that supply of electric vehicles, certainly we saw this last year, and we're still seeing it in pockets this year, where when I talk about the number of electric vehicle sales and those sales doubling every year, that has, for us, we don't use that as an indication of demand at all for Australia. Because often what we're finding is that all of the electric vehicles that come to Australia are sold out. We are much more supply constrained than we are demand constrained. And this isn't some dirty secret. Car companies tell us very bluntly, it's because you don't have these standards. They're not hiding the facts. They tell us you don't have these standards, therefore, we're the Australian office. We pitch our head office to get more, and our head office says, get your act together. You guys don't have these standards. I need to sell these cars to the USA or Europe to avoid penalties. I don't need to sell them to you, so you'll get what's left over.
Yeah.
And it is also this, I think, quite strange experience of not all the car companies are good actors in this stuff, but where you have the sector that's getting regulated saying, please come and regulate us. You need to fix this issue. We need an even playing ground. There's something actually wrong here. And particularly when you look at the way that these standards came about in so many other countries where it was against really fierce resistance by some of these companies, and they're saying, well, that's over now. But that was a fight we had back in the 80s and the 90s. Now we're saying, get on with it.
Get on with it.
Often say in some of these things, and certainly, we've made a lot of progress in policies, both in our state and federal governments over the last few years, but a few years ago, the state of these policies, they used to say for a car company, it's like showing up to a country that hasn't built roads yet. We were a country that was still debating whether or not electric vehicles are the real thing. And you get car companies that made their mind up about that, 5, 10 years ago, showing up and going, what on earth are you people doing? Why are you guys debating this as if it's actually a debate? And I think it's, as you and your listeners know, that there is a debate in the automotive industry. It's about how long will it take? It's not about whether or not it will happen. And I think particularly in those last few, 5 or so years we've been doing this work, a lot of our work has been, I guess, introducing what the real nature of the actual electric vehicle agenda and debate has actually looked like globally. Because I think certainly when we started, the questions really were, is this just some flash in the pan, thing of the day? Will this come and go, or will it really stick around? And we were explaining, actually, that's no one's having that discussion anymore.
No,
that's how far behind we are.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what was the interesting thing here, the reaction to the sort of extension of the 2030 vehicle ban. The people who were the most upset and would have done a lot of lobbying, and we wouldn't have been aware of it, were the car companies.
Yes.
Because they have built their entire manufacturing structure, and they're ordering. You imagine ordering raw materials, or we need this much steel, this much stuff, and they've done all that, and then suddenly go, oh God. So it was really interesting, because you'd think it would be like me and a few other people, and some people who drive Teslas, and some people who environmental activists. I mean, it was them, but it was also these huge multinational, big capitalist companies that said, "Come on, don't muck about." I mean, I think the thing we're seeing is, I would never rely on it, but certainly the polls are indicating that we're having a big change of government next year, and we know the new transport minister, and he said the first thing we'll do is reinstate the 2030 ban because everyone wants us to. It's not even for any other reason. But a thing I wanted to, there's a couple of really big things that I became super aware of when I was in Australia last year. But I guess one of them, the sort of obvious thing people might think about Australia if they've not been, or they've visited a couple of times, they're not that well aware, is it's ever so big. And that's you then think, oh, I'm in an electric car driving along one of those big long roads, and then you run out, and then you're doomed, and you'll be eaten by a snake. And but I mean, because from my memory, the actual statistics of average daily mileage in Australia are basically the same as they are in Europe. It isn't 800 miles a day. That's not what people drive.
No, that's right. And so, I mean, there's a really interesting point. It's something that we grapple with a lot because we're such a large country, people drive less than they do in Europe, because you can't get very far, right? I sort of joke that in Europe you can drive 3 hours and end up in Paris. In Australia, you drive 3 hours and get to a truck stop somewhere. And you're 1/3 of the way to where you eventually need to go. Yes. So, but certainly, with our consumers here, this comes up a lot of, well, we're a big country, so we drive a lot, right? And you can break it down for every single individual and say, actually, how let's take a look at your mileage, and let's take a look how far you're driving, and we have our census data and everything else, and that tells us that it's not true. And certainly from the time that I started doing this work, you get the different approaches from people, the people who have all the data, and they say, well, it's not true, so it's not a problem, and don't worry about it. So, well, actually, people feel like it's true, so therefore it is something we need to address, because they're the ones who need to buy the electric vehicles, and they're the ones who need to go on this journey. And so similarly, it's as we look at, whether it's the size of batteries and the range of vehicles, to the speed of recharging, to the type of, the amount of fast chargers necessary, to home chargers and the rest, all of these things exist there where people feel like, they're concerned, they feel like they need a lot more than they do. So how do you solve those two issues of, you can't ignore the way that they feel, you can't ignore that sentiment, you have to give people that comfort, but you also have to be able to build in the way, and you have to address the problems in the way of knowing that that's not exactly what the problem actually is. Yeah. So you sort of have to be able to do both, right, of actually solving the real problem while also solving that sentiment challenge. The thing that gives me quite a lot of hope in that is that, like I say, I didn't come at this work from a vehicle background. I wasn't some huge car nut who sort of thought a lot about this as a vehicle challenge. So I looked at it, I was working in renewable energy, sort of looked at it from a technology perspective. And where I get a lot of hope is that whether it was elevators or airplanes or, the internet, these sort of very human concerns always exist. If it's
Yeah.
something new, people get a bit anxious about it. And we often, I think, in the sector talk about, how do you convince everyone? How do you get everyone past it? And I often think, actually, I think about the first time that I went from a landline to a mobile phone to a smartphone. There was never a big aha moment. A little bit because I'm a bit of an early adopter, but for most people, there's not some huge aha moment of,
Yeah.
I now choose to own an iPhone. You just sort of do because that's the thing that you're supposed to do at some point.
Yeah.
And I think outside of the early adopters, it's actually, sort of go back to that word of how do we build the ecosystem? Because
Yeah.
for most people, they're not going to decide, now I am going to buy an electric car. It's time to buy a car, and of course I'm buying an electric car. And
Yeah.
I think certainly from a desire perspective, I can see that most consumers are there of, I would certainly, if I'm going to buy a car, I would like it to be an electric one. And am I comfortable enough? And that really tells us just how close we are to those really huge pivot points of, hitting numbers like 80, 90% very quickly of people just going, yeah, I've got a couple of these concerns and I can see that they are addressed or that they're being addressed. Because I certainly find in my work, I don't spend a second trying to convince people to like electric vehicles anymore.
No.
Consumers are there. They're excited. They're enthused. They just want to know that things are sort of being taken care of so that they can go on the journey as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it is, I did it last year. Oh, sorry. I always think it's last year. It's this year, still this year. My wife and I drove round a long way. We did, I don't know what, 5,500 kilometers in a few weeks.
Right.
Because we were visiting friends, when we didn't fly,
right.
and because we were loaned a Polestar, which made it less unpleasant. It was very nice. But I mean, it was interesting so quite often I could tell we were some of the very first people to use a rapid charger at the back of a gas station or whatever. We weren't the first, but they were really, really new. And that was two good things were, one, they were there, two, they were really new, three, they worked. Because we've been through this painful period in the UK where some chargers were put in and you'd turn up there and the damn thing wasn't working, So
I think that teething issues are certainly a normal part of this as well. And I've mentioned this a few times of we're doubling the number of electric vehicle sales every year. I think last year we sort of increased the number of public chargers by about 50%. This year, looking like another 40 to 60%. We'll know, we count at the end of the year, so we'll know very soon, but it's looking north of 40% already. So those are great stories from a growth perspective, right? Of showing the trajectory, but it's also exactly what you're talking about. Of that means that all of the stuff's also very new. It's the fact that you're the first person to use it is an increasing phenomenon because a lot of the charges being built are being commissioned right now. Every month we're getting more and more charges being commissioned. It's something that I sort of reflect on back in 2016, 17, when we started doing this work, we used to look back, so when we have our reports and the things that look back, but just as individuals, we used to look back every 12 months and go, wow, look how much everything has changed. The sector feels completely new to what it used to be 12 months ago. And now I say we do that once every 2 or 3 months.
Right.
The world, the industry, the sector, the world of electric vehicles in Australia looks entirely different every 3 months.
Yes.
And that's just how fast things are growing, how fast things are being built and sort of being commissioned, built, going live. So it is it's a really exciting time to get to be a part of what is happening, of just how that rapid rate that things are moving at, the amount of people involved and the amount of goodwill and sort of getting all of that work done.
Yeah. But the other one that I think is very relevant to Australia, to the whole world, but I first became sort of properly aware of it at our Fully Charged Live show in Sydney this year, was the emergence of China as an automotive manufacturing superpower. And that was so heavily underlined at our most recent show, which was in Amsterdam, where all the cars, with the exception of Tesla and Hyundai and Kia, who all had stands there, all the other cars, and there were a lot of them, were all electric, and quite a lot of them were all Chinese. Sorry, all Chinese electric cars. And I spoke to numerous Dutch people there, and Norway has had a lot of these cars for a while, and they've sort of come down into Denmark, and you can buy them there, but they hadn't quite reached the Netherlands. This is why they were sort of launching them there.
Right. Okay.
And quite a lot of the Dutch people said, I've never heard of this make before.
Okay.
And they're looking at this beautifully made, definitely European level manufacturing quality. They're not like the Chinese cars were 10 years ago. They're really well put together. But I mean, my sister-in-law in Brisbane has a BYD Atto 3 and is obsessed with it and loves it.
Yeah, it's something that we have seen absolutely skyrocket and change our market in Australia, right?
Yeah.
We looking at brands for us like MG and BYD. MG very quickly have already raced their way into the top 10. I think they're now like the sixth top selling car brands. They launched in Australia formally in 2016. I think more significantly around 2020. So once upon a time, reaching the top 10 car brands used to take a car company over a decade to achieve. And now you're finding these brands are coming in and they're doing it within a short few years. BYD, again, is our second highest selling electric car brand in Australia. Still very new, right? They've just launched their second and third model of vehicles here in Australia. China as a whole, as a manufacturing and an export nation, has just become the third highest selling import nation of cars in total in Australia. So it's Japan, Thailand, then China. That's happened within a span of, I think it's been 2 or 3 years. They've gone from being almost nowhere to being number 3. I think, again, I quite often look at this, and particularly given these are brands that are targeting the volume end of the market, right? These aren't sort of the Teslas and Pulsars. They're sort of going for everyone. I think we sort of end this decade with people looking back and not realizing that Chinese brands haven't always been a dominant force within our market, just because they are. You're right. They are bringing very high quality products at very low prices, and consumers are just eating them up. And so it's sort of really great to see. I mean, I know that one of our members, BYD, that sold here through EV Direct, they just quite recently said that they're together investing in another 30 retail stores in Australia. There's after having been launched a couple of years ago, now investing in another 30, and they've said their ambition is to hit number 1. They want to be the top selling car brand.
Right.
And you look at their product roadmap, you look at the type of vehicles and the segments of the market that they're looking to play in, and you think, that's not only is that absolutely the right target for them, of course, every car brand says they want to be number 1. That's an easy thing to say, but that's actually, I think, the correct target for them. And given how our market looks today and the players in it, I think it's also probably a pretty necessary one as well. Our top selling car brand in Australia today is Toyota. And we don't spend too much time talking about Toyota, but in a world where we are rapidly accelerating towards electric vehicles, it tells you that the brands that are making up those 1, 2, and 3 spots are going to have to change.
Yeah. Because, I mean, presumably Toyota's market share has had a bit of a couple of nips taken out of it in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it had. I mean, we saw, I think it was last year, we saw their market share went down by about as much as Tesla's went up by, so there was a bit of a shift there. Again, it's been a strange few years as well. This year we're seeing quite, I think vehicle sales in Australia are going to hit a record high because we are finally getting the backlog of COVID orders in.
Right.
It's I don't know how much this sort of relates to the UK, but, for the last couple of years, we saw it, for some models, we're still seeing, over 12-month waiting lists for cars and the like as well. So it's quite interesting for us trying to study things like sales trends, because really all we know in Australia is when deliveries are being made. Sales and deliveries are so far spread apart. But I think it's certainly as I say, there is that need for that new blood, whether it's car brands that are already there making their way up and increasing their market share, or new companies like BYD and others coming in and very quickly, rapidly making their way up. It's clearly necessary in our market. And the good news is we're seeing it happen, and we're seeing it be successful. These car brands are showing up to Australia, and they're very quickly racing their way up, into our sales charts.
Yeah. I mean, certainly because I don't get involved in the day-to-day operations of running as it now is, the Everything Electric show, which we'll be doing in Sydney in February. But I know that the amount of of Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers there is tripled even from last year. It's
I
just
mean,
extraordinary.
absolutely. And I'll give a hat tip to our friends at BMW who were kind enough to invite me to the Munich Motor Show
Right.
earlier this year as well. And, as you can appreciate, being the Munich Motor Show, it means that all the German brands show up there,
Yeah.
and all the other ones, may or may not, mostly may not, because it's not their country's motor show. So it was German brands plus a whole bunch of Chinese brands, And
Right.
so again, this is something that we're seeing, pretty rapidly around the world. I think some of the largest stalls of this, major global motor show were Chinese brands,
It's
and there's,
extraordinary, isn't it?
it's making it very clear that they're not kidding around. They're not putting their toe in the water. They are showing up, and when you look at the products that they are showing up with as well, you understand why. You're right. I think there used to be this sentiment about Chinese-made cars, but I think when you look closely, you realize that there were certain cars that they were building for segments of their own market, things like Chinese taxis, where the expectation is that it is very, very cheap, because if you're charging more than $5,000, there's no way you're going to get a sale there. Clearly, these brands have now turned their attention to the global market, and that doesn't mean that they're going to try to sell those Chinese taxis here. They're going to try to sell globally competitive cars, and they've shown that they're able to do that, whether that's by hiring the best engineers from around the world or their own ingenuity or whatever else it is. It is very clearly working.
Because it is a heartbreaking shame that, it's very similar to both our countries, is that when I first visited Australia, which is about 35 years ago, there was a lot of cars I'd never seen before, for one thing, because they were made in Australia for the Australian market. So I would rent a wreck, old sort of Holden. I don't even know what, but great, and I loved it. And they were
Commodore
big,
or a Statesman or
Commodore, yes.
Some marvelous cars that we used to make here and sell here. And I think we heard just quite recently from GM that one of their plans actually was to start building, I think, an electric Cadillac in Australia. They were talking about this very recently, just a few days ago. But unfortunately, they shut down before that ever really got off of the ground.
What a shame.
It takes me back to some of that conversation I was having about government regulations and things like fuel efficiency standards. But back when we had manufacturing, they were very powerful. So they used to get in the way of any type of regulations coming into effect. And so you ended up with really wonderful, really iconic Australian cars, but large V8 saloons, large sedans and saloons, and then car brands then complaining and saying, well, we can't sell these anywhere else in the world. We can't export these cars. And well, of course you can't. Nobody else will let you sell a car that's that inefficient, right? You forced us to have, very lax or no rules at all, and you can't sell them to anyone else because they all do have these rules. So I always like to say, like I've mentioned a few times, I didn't come at this work from the vehicle sector, but if you're in Australia and you work in the automotive sector, you get a lot of people who give you opinions about how things used to be. And, and I always say, anyone who tells you, this is the reason why Australian automotive manufacturing shut down, they're always wrong, because something as complex as that never has one reason.
No.
But certainly this played, this strategy of not having these type of standards in place, not making the type of cars that the rest of the world wanted, and the rest of the, where the rest of the world's automotive technology was at, certainly played a large role in that. And I think now we look at the way that electric vehicle sales have absolutely boomed recently, and you look at that quite sadly and say, we're so close to, the supply chain begins with us when it comes to battery metals.
Yeah.
That entire ecosystem could certainly exist here. I think could not only be flourishing, I think it could be growing compared to what it used to be. I could see a world where we still have, that, the vehicle manufacturing that we had, but also off of that had a much larger battery manufacturing industry here as well. And car manufacturers, whether in China or in Thailand, in Japan, anywhere else, were buying batteries from us. Whereas today, and it's something that we are trying to address finally in Australia, today what they're buying from us is raw minerals. I think we're getting something like 2 cents on the dollar of all of the minerals that we're selling, because everybody else is value adding onto them.
Right.
So we're finally coming to the party and developing our nation's battery strategies. But you think, we could have started on day one getting 98 cents on the dollar rather than 2 cents on the dollar, right?
Yes. No, it is very... We should round up soon. But on the whole, though, are you fairly optimistic about, the fact that, say, in 10 years' time, people won't be talking about electric cars; they'll just talk about cars,
Mhm.
and they
Yeah.
just happen to be electric. I mean, that's the feeling I get, sort of basically in most of Europe. They're becoming very, very normal.
Yeah, I am, and the main reason why is we've got the consumers. When we
Right.
when we offer consumers electric vehicle options, when we give them a chance to rent one or drive one, we can see that they're not just accepting of electric. We spent so much time trying to get them to understand and accept electric vehicles, and they very quickly leapfrogged us to being excited about electric vehicles.
Right.
So all of the other things from who's going to win the next election, is it going to be a more pro EV party or a less one, and we also have state governments and how do they act and all of
Yeah.
this day-to-day stuff. Yeah, it certainly causes bumps and peaks and troughs and all of the rest. But we've got the consumers on our side, so we're gonna come out of the other end of this winning. My only question is how much hair will I have left, or how big will my waistline be, based on the amount of stress it causes me
Yeah.
to get to the other end of it. Because
Yeah.
if we all work together well, very
Yeah.
smooth process. If not, a bit more bumpy. But we can see once that excitement for that new technology is there, it's very hard to tell a consumer to tell Australian drivers actually go back to wanting those crappy old, very expensive to run, smelly petrol cars. As you know very well, as charming as I am as an advocate, as soon as somebody sits in an electric vehicle and gets a chance to ride one as an Uber or drive one themselves, that's it. They're done. It's the veil drops and they go, well, why wouldn't I want this better experience? And enough people have had that chance that, we've won that part of the fight. Now it's just about they're ready. They want that car. And like I say, quite a lot of that is about making sure that we can get those secondhand vehicles in their hands, because that's really where about 80% of our market is. So making sure that they have one that is right for them.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. No, very good. Thank you so much. And I think I think through our experience, of being in this sector, because I'm the same as you. I don't come from a car background of any sort. It was really the engineering and the science that attracted me first of all, and what the implications are. If you say, well, we're going to use renewable energy in electric vehicles, you go, well, that's no, you can't do that. And then you go through these, you can do it a bit, maybe on a good day. And then you can realize that, the worldview changes. But I think the issue now with which I feel very is, been proven again and again, is the problems for people who've never had an electric car and never driven one. They are now psychological, not technological, because they'll come. Because even if you've not experienced, you go, well, what about, and I think that's completely legitimate that you're anxious about that.
It is a very human reaction, right?
Yeah.
And even if we weren't talking about the second most expensive asset that any house buys, their car, new things always have that emotional. I don't know, when I bought my first electric car, I knew the logic inside and out, but I still went on Google Maps and I checked the distances to things, because and I knew that what I was doing wasn't logical, but I had to go through the exercise. It's just this sort of stress out reaction. I think the other great thing for me, and it's very nice to talk today, is just how global this conversation is.
Yes,
the thing that I often say, you sort of mentioned Australia and our distances. The thing that I find is very common around the world is that in every country there is always but we're different from everyone else. The thing that everyone has in common is they all think they're different from everyone else. The things that work there won't work here. I'm like, trust me, they will. And sure enough, we're finding that we're right. The things that work everywhere else work here. Yes, there are unique aspects of it, but those unique aspects don't mean that they don't work. It just means that we have to address them in our own way.
Yeah. Now, look, it's been great talking to you about it. I mean, then also good luck with your continued, pushing the rock up the hill.
Looking forward to the shot in the arm of another great everything electric this time around.
No, me too. No, I mean it does. Because I'm always hesitant. I don't want to spook it. When I see the list of people who are going to be, it's got so much bigger. I reckon it's about 3 times bigger than the first year. That was one of the great things we learned at Fully Charged Live Sydney this year, was that we sometimes sell tickets on the door, like we have done here. Like, but it'll be like, I think at Farnborough, it was maybe 100 tickets out of 45,000. It was a very small minority. In Sydney, mate, I don't know what it was, but day one, we had like 1,000 people waiting to buy tickets. And we went, oh my God, did you not buy them before?
Australia,
and we went set up.
I think is the moral of this story. We just happy go lucky. We show up. Yeah,
we just rock up. We rocked up and we got in. I mean, they all got in.
With that,
so that was.
What do you mean?
It was great for us because you always, on the first show you do like that, you always have a fear that no one's going to come.
Yeah,
and it's not a market we know well. And
you want people to turn up.
Yeah, it's quite good when they do. It's very reassuring, and I think they will at this one. But I mean, I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be quite different, but it'll be, I mean, to be honest, it's never a chore to have to visit my in-laws in Australia. I'm very lucky. Sure. I feel very privileged.
As well, getting away from your UK winter thing is.
Yeah, it's not been that. I can actually see out of my window a slither of slightly lighter cloud. But the rest of it is grim and grey.
It's going to be a great time of year to be here.
Yeah, no, looking forward to it. It'll be good to see you there. Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely, looking forward to it, mate.
Really hope you enjoyed that. It was great to talk to Behyad. I can't wait to see him when we're in Australia. I do realise how incredibly privileged and lucky I am to be able to go there. For the very few of you who might have any interest in it at all, why I have been married to an Australian for the last 36 years. So obviously I have quite a strong connection with the country. I've actually lived there quite a bit, spent a lot of time there. It's very close to my heart. But that's it. That's all. Another episode coming next week, which is going to be amazing, but I'm not going to tell you about it now. But as always, if you have been, thank you for listening.